Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the Cipher Brief studio. I'm Tom Nagorski. Great to have you with us. We're here for a conversation today about an area of U.S. military preparedness that I think it's safe to say doesn't get a lot of attention, or maybe not enough attention. And our guest today thinks it's imperative that it does get more attention. We're talking about the risks of cyber attacks and the threat to military mobility. Our guest is co-author of a new report about this issue. The report is titled, I'm going to read the whole title, Persistent Access, Persistent Threat, Ensuring Military Mobility Against Malicious Cyber Actors. And we will let our guest explain the issues in play here. Annie Fixler is Director and Research Fellow at the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And Annie, thanks for being with us. And let's start with a basic question. When you and your colleagues set out to prepare and research this report, what's the basic problem or issue that you felt needs addressing here?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. This is a really important issue, as you said, doesn't get quite enough attention. In general, there's sort of too much siloing between traditional national security folks and critical infrastructure and cybersecurity experts. Those of us who deal with critical infrastructure security and cybersecurity understand its importance to national security, but some of our colleagues in the more traditional national security space have less exposure to that. So I am troubled by that, but appreciate the opportunity to take a moment to explain that issue. In general, the challenge is that a lot of the folks in the national security space sort of depend on the resilience and the secure operation of critical infrastructure, but don't appreciate how at risk those infrastructures are. And so we, with our report, tried to draw attention to particularly transportation infrastructure. As I'm sure many folks are aware, military bases require, obviously, electricity, power, water, telecommunications, and a lot of that is civilian owned and operated as well. But we specifically looked at the issue of moving our troops and equipment from fort to port, is what it's called. So from the military base across the United States to a seaport and overseas. And that requires transportation infrastructure that is owned and operated by the private sector.
Right. So is there an assumption here, I guess in a way you've said it already, that in the event of not a crisis, but it might be a crisis or a reason, as you say, to ship troops a long way beyond our shores, that a malactor, is that malign actor, would somehow compromise the transportation, right? But burrow down a little, and what are we talking about here?
Sure.
In terms of how that might work.
Right. I mean, it's not just an assumption or a guess that adversaries might do this. What we've actually seen is the compromise of that infrastructure. So your readers may be familiar with Volt Typhoon is a Chinese operation, a Chinese cyber operation that burrowed deep in multiple critical infrastructure sectors to sort of lie in wait to activate disruptive and destructive capabilities at the time of Beijing's choosing. And some of the infrastructure where Volt Typhoon actors were found were transportation infrastructure. So it's not a hypothetical. Adversaries know that that's the infrastructure we need, and so they're pre-positioning assets there. The issue with specific disruption is if a critical airport is affected, if critical rail lines are affected, is there enough resiliency in the system? Is there enough backup in the system to find alternate routes? And our concern is that there isn't that robust. The system is not as robust as it needs to be because there's an assumption of that assets will be available. And our concern is that they really won't. And we've seen demonstrated attacks, ransomware attacks, and criminal operations that have severely degraded the operation of that infrastructure. So if criminals can do it, nation states certainly can.
The future of national security is here. Introducing the Cipher Brief's NatSec Edge Conference, June 5th through 6th, 2025 in Austin, Texas. Join leaders from intelligence, defense, private industry, and investment as they explore the innovations shaping tomorrow's world. Gain critical insights, connect with top minds, and shape the future of security in an interconnected world. Don't just witness the future, be a part of it. Secure your spot now at natsekedge.com.
Is there a particular weak link when we're talking about military mobilization in the, in these areas you've just outlined that you think needs sort of the most urgent attention?
Oh, it's hard to pick the most urgent because it all feels so urgent together. We looked specifically, again, at transportation infrastructure, but not all transportation infrastructure. We specifically looked at aviation, rail, and ports. And within those, the Defense Department has already designated what are called strategic seaports and strategic rail corridors, and also sort of strategic airports, although they don't use that particular terminology. So the Defense Department already knows the assets that it needs. So we should be prioritizing those assets to make sure that they are resilient, not just physically, but also in cyber, and have a sense of cyber resiliency against operational attacks.
You also, in the report, say, I'll just read a short quote here, that beyond the disruptive capability that this kind of cyber attack might engender, that it would allow, quote, U.S. adversaries to amass information about the movement of goods and military equipment. Again, I mean, I'm not sure, that almost sounds worse, but is it generally that, so you might make it very hard for a unit of troops to go from point A to point B, but you're also going to make it easier for, let's say, China in this case, to know who and what is going where, right?
Exactly, right. It's exactly that. So you can imagine the mobilization of forces is very noisy. It just sort of, you can see it happening sort of on the ground. You can see it happening with sort of cyber artifacts, the communication between different assets. So an adversary that is in the system or is watching in various places in the system can see that happening. So I'll give you one example. We raise a particular concern about Chinese-made ship-to-shore cranes. They're the sort of the big equipment at ports that move containers from ships to the dock to the truck to the train, etc. On those cranes, it's not just that they are giant pieces of equipment that are basically giant computers. When the House China Select Committee did an investigation about a year and a half ago, give or take, they were looking specifically at this issue. And one of the challenges and concerns they had is that they found cellular modules on those cranes that were not requested by the company that purchased them, and in some cases specifically declined. So there were extra communication devices in those cranes that had no purpose, and the company was unaware that they were there. It seems to me, and I think it's logical to assume, that is a piece of equipment that China specifically wanted on that crane because it gives them valuable data.
Right.
And so that is the concern, that there are those kinds of pieces of equipment. We know that it's a problem in cranes. I think there's a problem that we don't know all of the places where it might also be occurring.
And just this gets from critical infrastructure issues to sort of, wartime military questions. But I think you said in your answer that presumably China will know. It's a noisy business. I think that's the term you used. If the U.S. were to mobilize, again, I assume we're talking here about a war potentially in the Pacific, perhaps involving Taiwan. The Chinese are going to know, without having wormed their way into our critical infrastructure, a fair bit about troop movements, one would think. What's the additional data that they can get onto in the ways you've described?
Sure. I mean, the nuances of that, I think, I can't speak to so much. I would ask a military planner, what do you want to keep secret? Because you don't have that secrecy anymore. Presumably, yes, China's going to see it. It's noisy. China's going to know that they tripped a red line, presumably. So they're going to know that we are mobilizing forces. But the specific details of maybe which assets, which kind of forces, which battalions and whatnot, perhaps that is advantageous. Again, I would ask them, the folks who are doing that planning, what are you trying to keep secret? Because it's not a secret anymore.
Mm-hmm. Now let's get to recommendations, because you have a lot of them, and I don't expect you to read. I think I counted 13 in the report, if I'm not mistaken. But what are the key things? Because underlying everything in your report and even your comments here is another assumption, which is that not enough is being done, right? So what are some of the, particularly the ones the layperson might understand, what are some of the recommendations that you propose in the report?
Sure. So the first thing we lay out is that there is a lot of discussion and emphasis on minimum cyber requirements for critical infrastructure. That is important. That conversation is valuable, but it is disparate, and different agencies are sort of moving forward on their own, both at the federal level and at the state level, and that is challenging for companies. They are sort of spending a lot of time sort of demonstrating compliance with cybersecurity regulations rather than actually spending that time implementing cybersecurity tools, techniques, etc. So we're pushing sort of for that regulatory harmonization and reciprocity across regulatory regimes. That's sort of across all critical infrastructure. That is a challenge. Digging more into transportation, we're specifically calling for some more exercises. I think you won't find someone in the cyberspace or in the defense space that doesn't love an exercise because it reveals where our weaknesses are. It reveals what we don't know. So if we can do exercises both at the local level and at the national level, where we really focus on the transportation, do the transportations have the resilience to continue to operate through crisis so that the military can move the forces it needs to? And if we can do those exercises, we can reveal, are there particular nodes that are vulnerable? Are there particular types of equipment that is vulnerable? Where are the weaknesses that we're unaware of? So we're advocating for that. The last thing I'll mention, and as you said, we do have 13 because it wouldn't be a Foundation for Defense of Democracy's report if it didn't have a lot of recommendations. My colleagues and I pride ourselves in coming up with recommendations. But the last thing I'll mention is we do advocate for sort of targeted grant programs. In many cases, the companies we're talking about here are large companies, but there are a lot of small companies that are involved in critical infrastructure security that are owners and operators of the critical pieces of the network that the Defense Department needs. And they may not have the assets, the inventory, the resources to actually invest in cybersecurity. So with some targeted grant programs, focusing on those smaller companies, focusing on those critical assets, we can make a big difference. The federal government can sort of push those companies and provide the resources those companies need to do the investments they need to make.
Now, last question then has to do with urgency here. And again, this melds military and policy questions with critical infrastructure, things that you've been talking about. But how confident are you that first of all, that recommendations will be heard, listened to, some of them at least addressed? And then there's the timetable question, right? I mean, we're always foolhardy to try to predict when, if we are talking about a Pacific conflict, what the time frame may be. But we know it's not a decade. How long would it take, even if people in the relevant spaces were to respond favorably to your recommendations? How behind the eight ball, I guess, is the United States, do you think, in this
Sure.
domain?
No, I mean, it's challenging. I think there is appetite for critical infrastructure resilience. Cybersecurity, as those of us in the field like to say, is a bipartisan issue. Folks understand the importance of cybersecurity, but there does appear to be an appetite on the Hill for specific provisions that get at the critical infrastructure resilience that is applicable in sort of the military domain. So I'm hopeful there. In terms of timing, yes, a lot of cybersecurity investment is a long-term investment, but there are things that can be done now. I think when you saw sort of the information that the federal government provided to private sector actors regarding Volt Typhoon, private sector actors were able to take action pretty quickly to remediate that problem and to get Volt Typhoon out of their systems. Now, the problem has not been solved. Volt Typhoon is a persistent, aggressive actor, so China is continuing to try to penetrate infrastructures. But when the government declassifies what it needs to declassify, gets information into the hands of the operators, they can make positive change. So I'm hopeful that there are things that can be done to shore up systems to build resiliency in the short term, even as cybersecurity and resilience is a much longer term investment.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Annie Fixler, thank you so much for joining us. Annie Fixler is at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a director at their Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation. Great to have you with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.